Colonel Marcus Danforth spent 23 years believing that rank meant something absolute in the United States Army. He commanded the 2nd Brigade Combat Team, 4th Infantry Division in Baghdad during the surge of 2007. He knew how to move 3,500 soldiers across hostile territory. He knew how to coordinate artillery strikes with air support. He knew the chain of command existed for a reason. He believed this until the morning he walked into a pre-mission briefing at Camp Victory and saw 6 men in civilian clothes who refused to shave, refused to acknowledge his presence, and refused to explain why they were about to ignore every operational protocol he considered sacred. The operators from 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta sat in the back row of the briefing room with their chairs tilted against the wall. Their beards ranged from 2 weeks to 3 months of growth. They wore local clothing purchased in Baghdad markets, mixed with plate carriers that cost more than a staff sergeant's monthly salary. One had a Nike baseball cap. Another wore sandals. The youngest looked about 28. The oldest might have been 45. None of them wore rank insignia. None of them introduced themselves. When Danforth asked who was in charge, the man in the Nike cap said they all were, depending on the phase of operation. Danforth felt something crack in his understanding of military order. Marcus Danforth was not a man who questioned the system easily. He graduated from West Point in 1984. He served in the First Gulf War as a company commander with the 24th Infantry Division. He earned his master's degree in strategic studies from the Army War College. He commanded a battalion in Bosnia. He believed in the doctrine that had won World War II, contained Soviet expansion, and liberated Kuwait. That doctrine stated that overwhelming force applied through disciplined hierarchy produced victory. He believed technology and firepower created the conditions for success. He believed soldiers followed orders because the alternative was chaos. He was sitting in that briefing room to coordinate a joint operation because someone at Multinational Force Iraq headquarters decided his brigade needed to support a Delta Force mission, targeting a high-value individual in the Adhamiyah district. He did not yet understand he was about to witness an approach to warfare that would make him question everything he thought he knew about combat effectiveness. The disparity in equipment alone should have been a warning. On the head of each Delta operator sat a MICH 2000 helmet integrated with AN/PVS-31 Alpha Quad Tube night vision systems. The optical package alone cost $22,000 per operator. Each helmet also mounted a PEQ-15 infrared laser, Peltor Comtac hearing protection linked to MBITR Harris RF-7800 tactical radios, and an integrated camera system that transmitted real-time footage back to the operations center. Total value of the helmet system approached $35,000. Danforth soldiers wore standard ACH helmets with PVS-14 monocular night vision that cost $3,000 as a complete package. The difference was not marginal. It was an order of magnitude. The weapons told the same story. Delta operators carried customized HK-416 rifles, configured to individual preference. One had an EOTech holographic sight paired with a G33 magnifier. Another used an Elcan Spectre DR with variable magnification. A third mounted a Night Force ATAC or scope for precision work beyond 400 meters. Each rifle had been zeroed to that specific operator at ranges from 50 to 600 meters. Each suppressor had been individually selected for sound signature and back pressure characteristics. The estimated cost of each primary weapon system exceeded $12,000. The M4 carbines issued to Danforth's infantrymen cost $953 from the factory. They were good weapons. They were not custom instruments built around the physiology and preferences of one human being, but the real contrast appeared in the support infrastructure. Each Delta operator carried an ATAC-enabled Android tactical assault kit linked to the Blue Force Tracker network. They had access to real-time drone feeds, signals intelligence updates, and biometric databases that could identify individuals from gait analysis or thermal signature. Their plate carriers weighed 8 to 9 kilograms and contained level 4 ceramic plates rated to stop 7.62 by 51 millimeter armor-piercing rounds at point-blank range. Their total equipment load, including ammunition, water, medical supplies, and batteries, weighed between 32 and 43 kilograms depending on mission profile. A standard infantryman in Danforth's brigade carried between 55 and 70 kilograms. The Delta operators moved faster, fought longer, and had better situational awareness despite carrying significantly less weight. The technological advantage was obvious. What Danforth did not yet understand was that technology was the least important difference. The mission briefing lasted 17 minutes. The target was a former Iraqi army colonel named Rahman al-Tikriti, who had transitioned from Ba'ath Party loyalist to insurgent facilitator after the invasion of 2003. Intelligence indicated he coordinated vehicle-borne IED attacks that had killed 47 American soldiers and approximately 200 Iraqi civilians over 18 months. He operated from a safe house in Adhamiyah, a Sunni neighborhood north of the Tigris River, known for its narrow streets, three-story concrete buildings, and population density that made conventional raids catastrophically dangerous. The CIA had been tracking him for 9 months. 3 previous attempts to capture him had failed. 2 of those attempts used elements from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Both resulted in firefights that killed 14 insurgents, wounded 6 American soldiers, and allowed al-Tikriti to escape through networks of underground tunnels his forces had spent years preparing. The Rangers went in with overwhelming force because that was the doctrine. They breached with explosive charges, flooded the building with 30 to 40 soldiers, and attempted to clear every room in under 5 minutes. The problem was that 5 minutes gave al-Tikriti more than enough time to disappear. The Rangers were trained to win firefights. They were not trained to vanish into a hostile city for 2 weeks, grow beards that matched the local population, establish observation posts in buildings rented through Iraqi intermediaries, and wait without moving for 96 consecutive hours while recording the patterns of a single individual. That was a different skill set. It required a different selection process. Colonel Danforth listened to the Delta plan and felt professionally insulted. The operation called for 6 men, not 60, not 600. 6. They would infiltrate on foot through the Adhamiyah market district dressed as local contractors. They would occupy an abandoned apartment building 70 meters from al-Tikriti's safe house. They would observe for an unspecified period of days or weeks. When they confirmed his presence and established his pattern of life, they would either call in a precision strike or conduct a close target reconnaissance that identified every person in the building before a larger force moved in for capture. Danforth asked what backup was planned if the situation deteriorated. The man in the Nike cap said they would leave. Danforth asked what happened if they were compromised. The same man said they would not be compromised because they would leave before that became a possibility. Danforth said that was not a plan. The man said it was the only plan that had worked in 18 months. The colonel filed a formal objection in writing. He sent a memorandum to the Deputy Commanding General of Multinational Division Baghdad, stating that Delta Force methodologies were inappropriate for the operational environment. He argued that their force protection posture was insufficient. He noted that their lack of visible American military presence would embolden insurgents who needed to see overwhelming firepower to understand deterrence. He recommended assigning a ranger company to conduct a coordinated raid instead. His memorandum was read, acknowledged, and ignored. The decision had been made 3 levels above his authority. The mission launched at 2200 hours on a Tuesday in July 2007. Danforth was ordered to have a quick reaction force on standby in case extraction became necessary. He complied. He also assigned a staff officer to monitor the operation through the Joint Operations Center and provide him with hourly updates. He wanted documentation when this approach failed. But this was only the beginning of his education. The reason Delta Force could attempt an operation that Danforth considered suicidal was rooted in a selection process that had not fundamentally changed since the unit's founding in 1978. The operator training course, known internally as OTC, began with a premise that contradicted every assumption built into conventional military training. Selection did not measure peak physical capability. It measured the ability to make autonomous decisions after physical limits had been exceeded. Cognitive function had degraded, and external support had been removed. The United States military produced approximately 1.3 million active duty service members. Approximately 2,000 attempted Delta selection each year. Between 240 and 300 were accepted into the course. Between 20 and 30 completed it. The attrition rate fluctuated between 88 and 92% depending on the year. This was not accidental. It was the entire design. The course took place primarily in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, with Fort Bragg in North Carolina serving as the administrative and logistical hub. The terrain was selected deliberately. The mountains ranged from 600 to 1,300 meters in elevation, with dense hardwood forest, minimal trail infrastructure, and weather patterns that could shift from clear skies to freezing rain in under 2 hours. Summer temperatures reached 38 degrees Celsius with 90% humidity. Winter temperatures dropped to minus 12 degrees Celsius with ice storms that coated every surface in a layer of frozen precipitation. The environment was designed to be hostile enough to break psychological resilience, but not so extreme that physical survival became impossible with proper preparation. Candidates needed to fail because they could not think, not because nature killed them. The first phase consisted entirely of land navigation under load. Each candidate received a topographical map, a lensatic compass, and grid coordinates for a checkpoint located somewhere in the surrounding mountains. They were given no indication of how far they needed to travel or how quickly they needed to arrive. They walked alone. No partnerships, no support, no communication with other candidates. The first march covered approximately 24 kilometers with 14 kilograms of equipment. Candidates who arrived within the unstated time window were told nothing except the coordinates of the next checkpoint. Candidates who arrived outside the window were told nothing except to return to base. Only later would they learn they had been eliminated. The marches increased in distance and weight with each iteration. By the second week, candidates were covering 42 kilometers with 19 kilograms. By the third week, 56 kilometers with 23 kilograms. The final exercise, known among cadre as the long walk, required candidates to navigate 64 to 70 kilometers through mountainous terrain while carrying 25 kilograms of equipment and wearing boots that by that point had usually delaminated, come unstitched, or developed pressure points that had worn through multiple layers of skin. They were given no time standard. They were told only to begin walking. Many candidates crossed the finish line after 18 to 22 hours of continuous movement, only to be informed they had been too slow. Others arrived in 15 hours and were told the same thing. The actual cutoff time was never disclosed. The psychological effect of not knowing whether current performance was sufficient created a decision loop that separated soldiers who could self-motivate under uncertainty from soldiers who needed external validation to continue. Approximately 250 to 300 candidates began the course. After the first week, 180 remained. After the second week, 100. After the third week, 55. By the time the final march was completed, between 20 and 30 candidates remained. This represented an 8 to 12% pass rate. The physical toll was measurable. Stress fractures of the metatarsal bones occurred in approximately 40% of candidates who reached the third week. Patellar tendon strains occurred in 31%. Hypothermia requiring medical evacuation occurred in 6% during winter iterations. Candidates were not removed from the course for injury unless the injury prevented ambulation or created an immediate threat to life. Pain was not considered a valid reason to stop. Navigation errors were. A candidate who deviated more than 100 meters from the prescribed route was immediately eliminated, regardless of how quickly they had been moving or how many previous checkpoints they had reached successfully. The reasoning was simple. In operational environments, being in the wrong place by 100 meters meant the difference between observing the target and being observed by the target. No candidate was ever forcibly removed from selection. They either quit voluntarily or collapsed and were medically evacuated. Both outcomes were recorded as failure. The distinction was important. Delta Force did not want soldiers who could be pushed past their limits by external authority. It wanted soldiers who had internalized their own standards and would push themselves past externally imposed limits because mission success required it. This was not a subtle philosophical difference. It was the core selection criterion. A ranger could be ordered to assault a position and would execute that order with discipline and aggression. A Delta operator needed to decide whether assaulting the position was the correct tactical choice when communications were down. The plan had collapsed, and 3 lives depended on making the right call with incomplete information in under 10 seconds. Colonel Danforth knew some of this in theory. He had read the publicly available literature on special operations selection. What he did not understand was the cumulative effect of filtering 1.3 million candidates down to 200 operators over the course of 40 years. The unit did not grow. It did not lower standards to meet recruitment goals. It accepted failure as the default outcome and success as a statistical anomaly that could only be achieved by candidates who possessed cognitive and psychological characteristics that could not be trained into existence. You either had the capacity to operate autonomously in an environment of total uncertainty, or you did not. The course identified which category you occupied. It did not create the capacity. It only revealed it. The psychological evaluation phase came after the land navigation phase for candidates who survived. This was not a formality. It consisted of at least 3 extended sessions with clinical psychologists who held top-secret clearances and specialized in assessing personality disorders, stress responses, and decision-making pathways under cognitive load. Candidates were presented with scenario-based questions that had no correct answer. They were evaluated not on the decision itself, but on the reasoning process used to arrive at the decision and the candidate's ability to articulate why alternative choices were rejected. The goal was to identify individuals who could process ambiguous information, generate multiple courses of action, select one based on incomplete data, and commit to that selection without paralysis or second-guessing. Approximately 18% of candidates who passed land navigation were eliminated during psychological evaluation. The specific reasons were never disclosed. Candidates were told only that they did not meet psychological suitability standards. Those who remained proceeded to 6 weeks of small unit tactics training at Fort Bragg. This phase assumed complete mastery of basic infantry skills and focused entirely on movement techniques, room clearing procedures, vehicle interdiction, close quarters marksmanship, and communication protocols specific to 4 to 8-person teams operating without external support. Candidates fired between 8,000 and 12,000 rounds of ammunition during this phase. They rehearsed immediate action drills until the response to contact became automatic, regardless of fatigue level or cognitive degradation. They learned to clear a building in under 90 seconds with zero fratricidal fire, even when visibility was reduced to arm's length and auditory function was compromised by flashbang detonations. By the end of this phase, candidates could enter a structure they had never seen before, process the layout in real time, identify threats based on micro-expressions and body positioning, and neutralize those threats with precision fire while moving at speeds that made deliberate aiming impossible. This was not marksmanship in the traditional sense. It was pattern recognition, trained to the point of automaticity. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training followed. The course was designated SEREC and lasted 3 weeks, with the final phase consisting of 36 hours of captivity simulation. Candidates were stripped, subjected to stress positions, interrogated by personnel trained in psychological pressure techniques, and required to maintain cover stories under conditions designed to induce compliance. Approximately 9% of candidates failed this phase by breaking cover or providing information beyond name, rank, service number, and date of birth. The goal was not to teach resistance techniques that would work against professional interrogators. No such techniques existed. The goal was to identify candidates who could maintain operational discipline when physical and psychological discomfort became severe enough that most human beings would say anything to make it stop. Delta Force needed operators who would not say anything under those conditions. That trait could not be taught. It could only be tested. Language and cultural training came next for candidates who passed SERE. This phase lasted 9 to 12 months and varied by operational theater. Candidates assigned to Middle Eastern operations learned Arabic dialects specific to target regions. They studied tribal structures, religious sectarian divisions, social hierarchies, body language conventions, and cultural taboos that could compromise an operation if violated. They learned to move through an Iraqi city without attracting attention from locals who had spent years identifying foreign operators by subtle gait differences, eye contact patterns, and hand positioning. The training was granular enough that candidates learned which direction to pour tea, which hand to eat with, and how to sit in a market without occupying space the way an American naturally would. By the end of this phase, operators could pass casual inspection by individuals who had lived in the target region their entire lives. This was not disguise. It was cultural assimilation to a degree that most anthropologists never achieved. Sniper training was optional depending on team requirements and individual aptitude. The course ran 14 weeks and covered ballistics, wind reading, range estimation, hide construction, camouflage discipline, and shot placement on human targets at ranges from 100 to 1,200 meters. Candidates learned to remain motionless for 6 to 8 hours while maintaining visual focus on a target area the size of a doorway 800 meters away. They learned to calculate bullet drop and wind deflection without electronic assistance. They learned to control their breathing and heart rate to the point where the rifle recoiled predictably between heartbeats. This was not normal human capability. It was trained capacity that required thousands of hours of deliberate practice and physiological characteristics that could not be developed if they were not already present. The entire selection and training pipeline from initial application to operational deployment took between 18 and 24 months. The financial cost per operator was never officially disclosed, but estimates from defense analysts at the RAND Corporation range from $500,000 to $1.2 million depending on specialization. This did not include the cost of candidates who failed. If attrition was factored into the calculation, the effective cost per graduated operator approached $8 to $12 million. For comparison, the cost to train a Navy SEAL from recruitment to graduation was approximately $500,000. The cost to train an Army Ranger was approximately $70,000. Delta Force cost more because it selected from the top 5% of those populations and then filtered that group through an attrition rate that eliminated 9 out of 10 candidates. Danforth knew this in abstract terms. What he did not know was what it meant in operational practice. He was about to learn. The Delta team infiltrated Adhamiyah at 2300 hours on a Tuesday in mid-July 2007. They walked through the market district in groups of 2 wearing dishdasha robes purchased in Baghdad and carrying canvas bags that contained fragmented equipment loads. They moved with the flow of foot traffic, pausing occasionally at vendor stalls, exchanging brief greetings in colloquial Iraqi Arabic, and blending into the ambient population density that made vehicular surveillance nearly impossible. They reached the target building at 0100 hours. The building was a 3-story concrete structure with a flat roof and exterior stairs that accessed each floor independently. The ground floor was occupied by a textile shop that had closed at 1900 hours. The second floor was vacant. The third floor had been rented 2 weeks earlier by an Iraqi intermediary who worked for a CIA front company. The team entered through the third-floor exterior door and disappeared from external observation. Colonel Danforth received the first update at 0200 hours from the Joint Operations Center at Camp Victory. The update stated that the team had reached the objective and established an observation post. He asked how long they planned to remain. The answer was indefinite pending pattern of life confirmation. Danforth asked what pattern of life confirmation meant. The answer was that they needed to observe the target building for a minimum of 4 days to confirm al-Tikriti's presence, movement patterns, guard rotations, and the identities of all individuals entering and exiting the structure. Danforth said 4 days was unacceptable from a force protection standpoint. He was told that force protection was Delta's problem, not his. He asked what happened if they were discovered. He was told they would not be discovered because they were not going to do anything that would result in discovery. He did not understand what that meant. What it meant was that 6 operators were about to spend 96 hours inside a third-floor apartment in the middle of a hostile neighborhood without generating any signature that would indicate American military presence. They occupied a single room approximately 4 meters by 6 meters with one window facing the target building 70 meters away. They rotated duties in 2-person shifts. 2 operators maintained observation using spotting scopes and thermal imagers. 2 operators rested on foam sleeping mats. 2 operators maintained perimeter security and monitored the lower floors for any indication that their presence had been noticed. They did not cook food. They did not use running water. They did not speak above a whisper. They communicated with hand signals and written notes. They urinated into plastic bottles. They defecated into plastic bags that were sealed and stored in a corner of the room. When they needed to move, they moved in a crouch that kept their silhouette below the window line. When they changed position, they moved at a pace slow enough that the motion would not register in peripheral vision to anyone observing from the street below. The temperature inside the apartment ranged from 41 degrees Celsius during the afternoon to 28 degrees Celsius at night. The humidity fluctuated between 30 and 60% depending on time of day. Each operator consumed 4 liters of water per day, drawn from bottles they had carried in. They ate 1 MRE per day, supplemented with dates and flatbread purchased from local vendors by the Iraqi intermediary who had rented the apartment. Total caloric intake was approximately 2,200 calories per day, which was 800 calories below the recommended minimum for their level of activity and environmental stress. They lost between 2 and 4 kilograms of body mass over the course of 4 days. This was considered acceptable. Weight loss reduced metabolic demand and decreased the amount of waste that needed to be stored in the room. Sleep occurred in 90-minute intervals. Operators slept on their sides with their rifles across their chests and their kits still attached. They did not remove their boots. They did not enter REM sleep. They maintained what military sleep researchers call alert drowsiness, a state characterized by reduced cortical activity without complete loss of environmental awareness. This was a trained skill. Most human beings cannot sleep while maintaining threat awareness. Delta operators could because they had spent years conditioning themselves to treat sleep as a tactical necessity rather than a restorative process. The physiological cost was cumulative. By day 3, cognitive function had measurably declined. Reaction times increased by 12 to 18%. Decision-making accuracy decreased by 9%. But the operators continued functioning because they had trained to function at that degraded level. That was the point of selection. It filtered for individuals who could still execute complex tasks after their bodies and brains had been pushed past normal operational limits. Danforth received updates every 6 hours. The updates contained minimal information, team in position, no compromise, target building under observation, pattern developing. He found the brevity frustrating. He wanted detailed reports with timestamps, personnel movements, and contingency plans. He was accustomed to operations where information flowed vertically through established reporting chains. Delta operated horizontally. The team on the ground made decisions based on information they collected in real time. Those decisions were not transmitted upward for approval. They were simply executed. The operations center was informed after the fact so that support assets could be positioned if needed. Danforth considered this a dangerous erosion of command authority. He said so in a conversation with the Special Operations Liaison Officer assigned to his headquarters. The liaison officer, a Special Forces major with combat experience in Afghanistan, listened and then said something Danforth would remember for years. He said that Delta Force did not erode command authority because they never accepted it in the first place. They accepted mission parameters. How they achieved those parameters was their decision, not the commander's. On day 2 of the observation, something happened that was not reported to Danforth until after the operation concluded. At approximately 1400 hours local time, 2 Iraqi men approached the target building and stopped directly in front of the entrance. They remained stationary for approximately 40 seconds while conducting a conversation. One of them gestured toward the building where the Delta team was located. The distance between the 2 men and the observation post was 70 meters. Through the spotting scope, the operators could see their facial features clearly enough to identify them from photographs. One of them was smoking a cigarette. The other was holding a cell phone. For 40 seconds, neither operator in the observation post moved. They did not adjust their position. They did not transmit a warning. They did not prepare to evacuate. They simply observed while calculating whether the gesture had been random or whether it indicated compromise. The 2 men concluded their conversation and walked away. The team remained in position. This decision was never elevated to higher command. It was made by the operators in the room based on their assessment that the gesture had been coincidental and that departing would create more risk than remaining. If they had been wrong, 6 Americans would have been trapped in a building surrounded by hostile forces in a neighborhood where response time from quick reaction force assets was estimated at 8 to 12 minutes, depending on traffic and IED threat. Danforth learned about this incident during the after-action review. He asked why the team had not reported the potential compromise in real time. He was told that reporting would have required radio transmission, which would have increased electronic signature and potentially confirmed their presence if anyone was conducting electronic surveillance. He asked what would have happened if the men had been insurgents conducting reconnaissance. He was told the team would have killed both men with suppressed weapons, removed the bodies to the 3rd-floor apartment, and requested exfiltration under cover of darkness. Danforth asked if that plan had been pre-approved by higher headquarters. The answer was no. He asked who had the authority to make that decision. The answer was the 2 operators in the room at the time. This was the fundamental difference in operational philosophy. In conventional military doctrine, authority flowed downward from senior commanders who possessed strategic perspective. Tactical execution followed orders because individual soldiers did not have sufficient information to deviate from the plan. Delta Force operated on the opposite assumption. The soldiers on the ground possessed more relevant information than any commander viewing the operation from a distance. Therefore, they had the authority to make decisions that contradicted the plan if ground truth indicated the plan was no longer viable. This required a level of tactical competence and psychological maturity that could not be assumed. It had to be selected for through a process that eliminated anyone who could not be trusted with that level of autonomy. That was why the attrition rate was 91%. Not because the physical standards were insurmountable, but because the psychological standards were rare. By day 4, the pattern of life analysis was complete. Rahman al-Tikriti appeared at the target building 3 times per day at approximately 0900 hours. 1,400 hours, and 1,900 hours. He arrived in a different vehicle each time, driven by a different individual. He entered through the rear entrance and remained inside for between 40 and 90 minutes. He traveled with 2 armed guards who waited outside while he conducted business inside. The guards were equipped with AK-47 rifles and chest rigs containing spare magazines. They did not wear body armor. They scanned their surroundings but did not maintain consistent observation patterns. They spent approximately 30% of their time looking at their phones. This was the vulnerability window. The Delta team transmitted their findings at 0300 hours on day 5. They recommended a capture operation timed to coincide with al-Tikriti's 1,400 hours arrival window, when foot traffic in the surrounding streets was heaviest and the presence of additional vehicles would be least conspicuous. They requested a support element from 75th Ranger Regiment to establish outer cordon security and a helicopter package from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment to provide exfiltration if ground movement became untenable. Both requests were approved. The operation was scheduled for the following afternoon. At 1,300 hours, the Delta team exited their observation post and repositioned to a staging area 120 meters from the target building. They moved through the market district using the same blended movement techniques they had used during infiltration. They carried concealed weapons and wore local clothing that had been deliberately soiled and worn to match the appearance of manual laborers. They positioned themselves in an alley that provided direct line of sight to the rear entrance of the target building. The Ranger element established positions on rooftops 800 to 1,000 meters away with M40 sniper rifles and M240 machine guns. The helicopter package staged at Forward Operating Base Falcon, 12 kilometers to the south. Al-Tikriti arrived at 13:58 hours, 2 minutes ahead of schedule. He exited a white Toyota Corolla driven by an unidentified male. 2 guards exited with him and took up positions on either side of the rear entrance. Al-Tikriti entered the building. The Delta team waited. They waited because moving immediately would have placed them in the open during the 30 to 40 seconds it would take to cross the distance from the alley to the building entrance. That exposure window was unacceptable. They needed the guards distracted. At 1,411 hours, a vendor cart approached from the west selling roasted corn. One of the guards walked toward the vendor. The other guard remained in position but shifted his attention to watch the transaction. The exposure window dropped to 12 seconds. The team moved. 4 operators crossed the distance in a staggered rush that kept them below the sight line of the guard who was still in position. They reached the building entrance in 9 seconds. The guard realized something was wrong at the moment the lead operator was 3 meters away. He attempted to raise his rifle. The operator covered the remaining distance in 1.2 seconds and delivered a rifle butt strike to the guard's jaw that fractured his mandible and rendered him unconscious before he could vocalize a warning. The second operator caught the falling guard and lowered him to the ground to prevent noise. The third and fourth operators entered the building. The remaining 2 operators maintained rear security. Inside the building, Al-Tikriti was sitting at a table with 3 other men reviewing documents. The room measured approximately 5 meters by 4 meters. There was 1 door and 2 windows. The Delta operators entered and had all 4 men on the ground with weapons secured in under 6 seconds. Al-Tikriti did not resist. He was flex-cuffed, hooded, and removed from the building through the rear entrance. The entire action from door breach to exfiltration required 43 seconds. No shots were fired. No American personnel were injured. 2 guards were detained and later released. 3 additional individuals in the building were photographed, biometrically enrolled, and released. Al-Tikriti was transported to a detention facility where he remained in custody for the next 7 years before being transferred to Iraqi government control. Colonel Danforth watched the operation from the Joint Operations Center through a Predator drone feed. He saw the approach. He saw the takedown. He saw the exfiltration. The entire sequence was visible on a screen that measured 2 meters diagonally and was surrounded by staff officers who had been tracking this target for 9 months. When the helicopter lifted off with Al-Tikriti on board, the room erupted in muted applause. Danforth did not applaud. He sat in his chair and tried to reconcile what he had just witnessed with everything he believed about military operations. 4 days in an enemy-controlled neighborhood without detection. A takedown executed in broad daylight with 0 casualties. A target removed from circulation who had been responsible for dozens of American deaths. The operation had required 6 men. Danforth had been prepared to commit a company. The disparity was not just numerical, it was philosophical. The statistical comparison made the disparity explicit. The 75th Ranger Regiment had attempted 2 previous raids targeting al-Tikriti using platoon strength elements of 40 to 45 soldiers. Both operations resulted in firefights lasting between 18 and 32 minutes. Combined casualties: 14 insurgents killed, 6 American soldiers wounded, 0 high-value targets captured. The Delta operation: 6 operators, 43 seconds, 0 casualties, 1 high-value target captured. The jackpot rate, defined as the percentage of operations that successfully captured or neutralized the intended target, for Ranger-led direct action missions in Baghdad during 2007 was 41%. The jackpot rate for Delta Force missions during the same period was 76%. The compromise rate, defined as the percentage of operations where American forces were detected prior to engagement, was 31% for Ranger missions and 8% for Delta missions. These were not marginal differences. They represented fundamentally different operational effectiveness levels. Danforth requested a meeting with the Delta team leader the following day. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at Camp Victory. The team leader was the man who had worn the Nike baseball cap during the initial briefing. He was 41 years old. He had served in Delta for 14 years. He had conducted operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and several countries he would not name. His official title was Squadron Sergeant Major, but Danforth never learned his real name. He introduced himself as Mike. Danforth asked how they had remained undetected for 4 days in a hostile neighborhood. Mike said they did not do anything that would have caused detection. Danforth asked what training prepared them for that level of operational discipline. Mike said the training did not prepare them. The selection identified them. The training just gave them tools. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Danforth asked questions and Mike answered them with specificity that made clear he was not withholding information. He was simply describing a system that operated on premises Danforth had never encountered. At one point, Danforth asked why Delta operators refused to shave. Mike explained that beards served 2 functions. First, they reduced visual identification as American military personnel in environments where most adult males wore facial hair. Second, they signaled that the operator was not governed by conventional military grooming standards, which reinforced institutional culture around autonomy. Danforth said that autonomy was fine for special operations, but could not scale to conventional forces. Mike agreed. He said it was not supposed to scale. That was why selection eliminated 91% of candidates. The military needed soldiers who followed orders. It also needed a small number of soldiers who could operate without orders when the situation demanded it. Those were 2 different populations. Delta selected for the second population and accepted that most soldiers would never pass that filter. Danforth asked what made someone capable of passing that filter. Mike said he did not know. He said psychologists at the selection course had been trying to identify the predictive factors for 30 years and had not found a reliable model. Physical fitness was necessary but not sufficient. Intelligence was necessary but not sufficient. Prior combat experience was correlated but not deterministic. The best predictor was performance during the land navigation phase, which measured something that could not be quantified on standard psychological assessments. It measured the internal drive to continue when external motivation had been removed. Some people had it, most did not. You could not create it through training. You could only identify it through testing that pushed candidates until they quit. The ones who did not quit were the ones Delta wanted. This explanation fundamentally challenged Danforth's operational philosophy. He had spent 23 years believing that properly structured training could produce any required capability. The Army trained soldiers to operate tanks, fly helicopters, conduct parachute assaults, and coordinate combined arms maneuvers. All of those skills could be taught to individuals who entered the service with no prior knowledge. Mike was telling him that the core skill Delta required, the ability to operate autonomously under extreme stress, was not teachable. It was innate. Selection did not create operators. It identified them. This suggested that there were cognitive or psychological traits that were either present or absent at the time of selection, and no amount of subsequent training would create those traits if they were not already there. That meant the majority of soldiers, no matter how well trained or how motivated, could not do what Delta operators did. The limiting factor was not training or equipment or tactical doctrine. It was human variability. He asked Mike if that meant most soldiers were fundamentally less capable. Mike said no. He said it meant most soldiers were optimized for a different problem set. The Army needed soldiers who could execute coordinated operations as part of a large formation under unified command. That required discipline, cohesion, and the ability to suppress individual initiative in favor of collective action. Delta needed the opposite. It needed individuals who could function effectively when collective action was impossible and unified command was not available. Both skill sets were valuable. They were also mutually exclusive at the extreme end of the distribution. A soldier who was exceptional at following orders in a structured environment might fail completely when placed in an unstructured environment with no orders. A soldier who excelled in unstructured environments might create chaos in a conventional unit by refusing to defer to authority. Delta selected for the latter and accepted that it would never be a large organization. Danforth left that meeting and returned to his headquarters. He spent the next several hours reviewing the operation reports, statistical analyses, and after-action summaries. He read estimates from RAND Corporation analysts who had studied special operations effectiveness. He read classified assessments from the Joint Special Operations Command that compared Delta performance metrics to other Tier 1 units. The data converged on a conclusion he did not want to accept. The limiting factor in military effectiveness was not technology, firepower, or numerical superiority. It was the cognitive capacity of the individual operators making tactical decisions in real time under conditions of uncertainty. Delta Force was effective because it selected individuals with exceptional cognitive capacity and then trained them to apply that capacity in combat environments. The selection process was so brutal because exceptional cognitive capacity under stress was rare. You could not train it into existence. You could only find it. 6 weeks after the operation, Danforth was promoted to Deputy Commanding General of a division preparing to deploy to Afghanistan. He wrote a confidential assessment for his successor describing lessons learned from joint operations with Delta Force. The assessment was classified secret and distributed to brigade-level commanders throughout multinational force Iraq. In the assessment, he included a section titled Recommendations for Conventional Force Commanders Working with Special Mission Units. The section contained 12 specific recommendations. The final recommendation read, "Do not assume that special operations failures indicate flawed tactics. Assume instead that the tactics require personnel characteristics that conventional selection processes do not identify. If a Delta team assesses an operation as infeasible, treat that assessment as data rather than opinion. They are selecting from a cognitive distribution that your formation does not access." That was the closest Colonel Marcus Danforth ever came to admitting he had been wrong. He never used those words directly, but the recommendation structure made clear he had revised his understanding of what made military operations succeed or fail. He had spent 2 decades believing that properly applied force generated victory. He had witnessed a demonstration that cognitive capacity applied through autonomous decision-making generated better outcomes with fewer resources and lower casualties. The gap between those two approaches was not bridgeable through training or doctrine. It was bridgeable only through selection processes that most military organizations would never implement because they required accepting failure rates that looked like institutional dysfunction. The philosophical difference came down to institutional tolerance for failure. Conventional military training was designed to minimize failure by standardizing procedures and creating redundancy. If one soldier failed, another could take their place because they had been trained to execute the same tasks in the same way. Delta selection was designed to maximize failure by identifying the small percentage of individuals who could operate without standardization or redundancy. If an operator failed, there was no replacement because the traits that made them effective were not reproducible through training pipelines. That made Delta Force fragile in one sense. It could not scale, but it also made them exceptionally effective in situations where conventional approaches had already failed. They operated in the gap between what standard military formations could accomplish and what the mission required. Colonel Danforth learned this at age 47 after spending his entire adult life in uniform. He learned it because 6 men with beards and civilian clothing conducted an operation that his brigade could not have accomplished with 600 soldiers and air support. The lesson was uncomfortable because it suggested that hierarchy, discipline, and overwhelming force were not universally applicable principles. They worked in certain contexts. They failed in others. The contexts where they failed required a different kind of soldier, selected through a different kind of process. That process was brutal, expensive, and produced very few graduates. But the graduates could do things that no one else could do. That was the only justification needed. The final conversation Danforth had with Mike occurred 3 months later during a conference on counterinsurgency operations at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. They encountered each other in the lobby of the conference hotel. Danforth asked if Delta still refused to shave. Mike said yes. Danforth asked if he had ever regretted challenging their methods. Mike said nobody regretted challenging them because challenge was how you learned whether your assumptions were correct. He said the problem was not challenge. The problem was assuming that challenge constituted authority. Danforth had challenged their operational plan and filed a formal objection. That was appropriate. What would not have been appropriate was using his rank to override their assessment after they explained why his objection was not operationally sound. Rank did not grant understanding. Experience granted understanding. Delta had more experience operating in denied environments than any conventional commander. That made their tactical assessments more reliable regardless of rank structure. Danforth admitted he had not understood that distinction at the time. He had believed that his position as brigade commander gave him the authority to determine operational feasibility. Mike said that belief was why conventional operations had a 41% success rate and Delta operations had a 76% success rate. Authority did not make you correct. It only made you responsible for the consequences of being incorrect. Delta accepted that responsibility because their selection process identified people who were comfortable operating with that level of accountability. Conventional forces distributed responsibility vertically through command structures, specifically because most soldiers were not comfortable operating with that level of accountability. Both approaches were valid. They just solved different problems. That conversation ended Colonel Danforth's education. He returned to his duties with a revised understanding of what military effectiveness required and why Delta Force could not be replicated through doctrine or training reforms. The unit was not a collection of tactics or equipment. It was a concentration of human cognitive capacity that occurred naturally in approximately 1 out of every 10,000 soldiers. Selection did not create that capacity. It identified it. Training refined it. Operational experience sharpened it. But the underlying capacity was either present or it was not. That made Delta Force simultaneously the most effective and most irreplaceable element in the American Special Operations enterprise. You could replace equipment. You could replace tactics. You could not replace the operators because there was no training pipeline that produced them. They had to select themselves by refusing to quit when everyone else did. The last line of Danforth's classified assessment was never included in any public document. It was read only by officers with appropriate clearances and operational need to know. The line read, "I recommended against deploying Delta Force because I believed their operational security posture was insufficient. I was wrong. Their operational security posture was different. The difference was that they understood the environment better than I did. If I had been correct in my assessment, the operation would have failed. The fact that it succeeded with 0 American casualties and complete mission accomplishment indicates my assessment was based on assumptions that did not apply to their methodology. I will not make that mistake again." He never did.